This is Baltimore, but not the part of Baltimore of Freddie Gray and Corinne Gaines. Not the part of Baltimore that has been neglected and left to decay. Not the part of Baltimore where tens of thousands of children are poisoned by lead. Not the part of Baltimore where the schools are closed and hope for a bright future is hard to come by. No, that happens out there in the horizon. It happens here, the parts of Baltimore that have seemingly been forgotten. The parts of Baltimore that have been devastated by decades of ill-intended practices and policies. The parts of Baltimore where a child's full potential is stripped away before he or she can talk. Hypersegregation and lead poisoning are pervasive in Baltimore City, but often overlooked. This film is a look at both factors and how each factor affects the city.
Well, the interesting thing about Baltimore is that it is the place where residential racial segregation really sort of kicks off. And so this all happens in 1910 when Baltimore becomes the first city in the United States to pass a comprehensive racial zoning law. And so you had this sort of pre-existing racial segregation in education and transportation when in 1910, Baltimore, because of a black lawyer named George McMecken, he moves on into 1834 McCullough Street, and which is an all-white block at the time. And he moves in there, and his home is attacked. You have rocks that are being thrown at his house into the windows. His steps, marble steps, are tarred with black tar, so it really defaces his property. And the white community was basically trying to figure out, like, how do we keep this Negro out? And so eventually I think they sort of figured out, Baltimore, Maryland is a border state. It's situated between the North and the South. It sits right on the edge, and it sort of has an ambiguity that the Deep South doesn't have. In the Deep South, black people more or less were put in a position where they knew their place. But in Baltimore, there's a bit more ambiguity. So I think that helps explain why Baltimore passes this law to make it very explicit. Whereas the city was closer to the North, it was Baltimore's way of reminding people, no, this is still the South. And so they passed this racial zoning law under then Mayor John Berry Mahul. He passes as mayor this first law in 1910. And so from there, he's leaving office. The next mayor comes in, Mayor James Preston. And he, in fact, is Baltimore's most racist mayor in the history of the city. He basically comes up with the scheme after scheme to sort of intensify racial segregation. John Berry Mahul, he passed the first racial zoning ordinance. Mayor James Preston, he tries to pass 3 more, and they're all struck down by the courts. Then he comes up with another scheme, basically because there was a public health epidemic that was taking place at the time, and it was disproportionately impacting black people. And it was disease like tuberculosis, yellow fever, cholera, that was more endemic in the black community because of the slum housing, the slum conditions that a lot of black people were made to live in. They were living in unsanitary, this is before the age of the time of sewer systems were in place, before certain alleys were paved. And so a lot of black people lived in these wooden shacks in the alleys between the row houses in the city. And so in those unsanitary conditions, when you have waste kind of flowing through the sewers or through the alleys, unpaved alleys, that waste gives rise to this disease, tuberculosis, being more endemic in black communities. And so racial segregation then was really founded on the basis of the foundation of public health, trying to keep those people away from the white community. Baltimore tries over and over again to enforce racial segregation. They utilize everything from racially restrictive covenants, which are put in place by the Roland Park Company.
Restrictive covenants are parts of a deed. They're paragraphs, documents that are included with the deed, so that if I buy a house, I can't sell it to Jews or black people or Muslims or whomever is listed in the covenant. And these were prevalent during the 1910s on up until probably well into the 60s, if not later, in white neighborhoods like Roland Park.
Several places that I have purchased had on its deed that property was not to be transferred to an African American, and depending on the age of the land record, there were land covenances that prohibit Jews, Italians, Greeks, and many ethnic groups from being able to obtain property. It stuck with African Americans as they used this redlining through public policies and practices in a subtle way.
Historically, redlining was a concept developed in the 1930s by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC it's called. And it was a series of maps. They were all over the country in every major city that literally people drew on them in different colors. And it meant that, you know, black people couldn't live in certain neighborhoods. Certain neighborhoods were white only. Certain neighborhoods were, it was okay for Jews to live there, but not these other people. And so they were red, green, blue, and yellow.
Well, redlining is really the weaponization of racial segregation. You take a community and you put them into a zone, an area where only they can live. And once you do that, now you can impose other kinds of social penalties like hyper-policing. You can impose economic penalties like redlining. Redlining is a tool, a policy tool, that the government would use to basically say, we won't insure the mortgages or the loans that banks may give in a certain area. So in effect, after the Great Depression, many banks were very skittish. They didn't want to lend money until the federal government stepped in and said, we will insure those mortgages or those loans. Well, the federal government said in their residential security maps, we won't insure those loans in red areas. And red areas were the areas where African Americans lived. They're the areas where urban Native Americans lived. And so these were the people that were socially marginalized, socially despised at the time. And the federal government says we won't insure the lending in that place. So what happens? Then banks decide, well, we won't lend. We won't invest in these communities. We won't even place branches in those communities. And so what happens is that these communities become starved of capital year after year, decade after decade. So redlining is essentially starving a community of investment, starving a community of capital, of resources, of opportunity. And in fact, not only does the private sector redline black communities, but even the public sector, governments redline communities as well. And so here in Baltimore, we have redlining on either side of the center of the city, in East Baltimore and West Baltimore. And both of those communities were redlined in 1937. And over 80 years later, if we go and look at those communities, they're very much redlined today.
Redlining is very much alive and well today. In places like Baltimore, we see the distinction between various neighborhoods. Baltimore is still a African American majority city. However, in the minority neighborhoods, you actually see prominent economic engines and anchors that actually supports and make it possible for folks to be able to participate in the full range of of living in this society.
Black families in Baltimore don't have the same opportunities as white families. They are preyed upon by unscrupulous mortgage lenders. They're charged a higher interest rate on mortgages if they're even given a mortgage in the first place. Chances are, even if they have the same credit score as a white borrower, they're not going to get the same interest rate as the white borrower. They're not given the same economic opportunities. Schools are redlined. I mean, Baltimore is a very segregated city. So, and it's segregated black and white. It's not just an economic segregation. It's not just a class segregation, as people would like to have you believe. Baltimore is segregated black and white, as it has been since the 1910s.
At the same time, African Americans were seeking to become fuller in society. So we had a burgeoning, growing black middle class. And this middle class wanted to kind of spread its wings. It wanted to be able to live in better accommodations. And so, as one would have it, they would seek out neighborhoods that they believed would better afford their family a better way of living. So they would go to a community that was primarily white, or a row of houses, as Baltimore is famed for row houses. And so during this process of blockbusting, there was a scheme between the real estate agents and some of the city agents to steer people, middle-class black family, to a white community, to a white block, and sell to them a dwelling, and then as a result, do a scaring tactics around other white families that were there to say to them, uh-oh, this area is changing.
Well, blockbusting is a private sort of practice. You find the real estate agents, they would basically try to scare white people out of their homes, because the thinking is if white people would leave, often they would sell their properties for a low value because they're trying to get away from the black people that are moving in. So they would sell low, which would allow the blockbuster then to obtain the home for a cheap price and sell to a middle or upper income black person who's desperate to get out of lower economic conditions and buy a nice home. Because again, the federal government and banks, they were not lending. So black people could not get homes through traditional means. They had to go through the blockbuster, who was buying the home for cheap but selling high. And so what you find is that blockbusters actually were sort of predatory lenders. They were people who would obtain homes for cheap, sell them to African Americans for a surcharge that this one group in Baltimore called the black tax. So black people would buy these homes, desperate to get out of overcrowded conditions in slum neighborhoods, so that they could also have a piece of the American dream. And so blockbusting would serve that sort of function of helping to accelerate white flight. Take those homes, sell them to African Americans who actually had money, but charged them a higher price for those homes. And so they made a nice fat profit.
Now, in 2018, they post up those, those "We Buy Houses" signs. So everybody knows that the minute that you start seeing those signs in a neighborhood, they want you to think that the neighborhood is in decline, in the hopes that the white people who live there will sell quickly and cheaply, and then they can move black people in, probably as renters. And so blockbusting is literally what it sounds like. It's busting up a community, making some people flee and bringing other people in, and playing the two groups against each other and playing their fears against each other.
The more a city is racially segregated, the more intense the dysfunctions of a city will be. The more dysfunctional it will be, the more painful a city will be and harmful will be for its black residents. So you have this predatory economic behavior, the segronomics, that leads to the lead poisoning crisis being so pervasive in black communities in Baltimore. And so, by 1994, even though Maryland is passing these strong policies to help reduce lead poisoning, you still have 12, 13,000 black babies that are still being poisoned by lead poison at over 10 micrograms per deciliter of lead in their blood, including a young baby in 1994 whose name was Freddie Gray. And so Freddie Gray, he's poisoned in one of these homes owned by slumlords. And then you look at his life and where he ends up in 2015, arrested by police here in Baltimore City. His leg apparently being broken. He's put into the back of a van, but he doesn't emerge conscious. His spine is broken in 3 places. His voice box is crushed. And you see, okay, police, they arrest him because he runs. He runs in a high crime area where the Supreme Court actually says you can police differently in a high crime area. So if a person runs, you're allowed to chase them even without probable cause. Well, what would cause Freddie Gray to run? Well, Freddie Gray is poisoned at 36 micrograms per deciliter of lead in his blood, which is way over the reference level for the CDC, which is at 5 micrograms per deciliter of lead is the reference. Freddie Gray was at 36. And so looking at how lead poison then plays a powerful role in his life, and then thousands of other children in our city, thousands of other young adults. Corinne Gaines, who was killed by Baltimore County Police in 2016, what was her situation? She was also lead poisoned, depending on which source you read, 12 or 22 micrograms per deciliter of lead in her blood.
Baltimore, for the United States, is one of the older cities, but being lying along the eastern seaboard. But Baltimore, like other cities around the globe that have an industrial and a manufacturing background, have a lead issue. Lead for thousands of years was a very usable material, used to line pipes and to actually make pipes and use it as a conduit for the conduction of water resources and so forth, or vessels to hold liquids like wine and so forth. So the issue is that with its many uses, lead was put into a lot of products, principally being as a no-knock additive in gasoline to allow internal combustion engine vehicles to run much more smoothly. And also, because of its corrosion resistive properties, put in paint, interior and exterior paint, and allows much more resistance to weathering and weathering episodes. And it works very well in that capacity. The problem is it puts this material in close proximity to people. It leaches over time, and where their people are active, particularly children, are active, it increases the exposure to, again, this very powerful neurotoxin, and then the potential for the negative impact grows higher and higher.
Lead affects the brain in the cognitive development, not only in language processing, emotional processing, the processing speed of stimuli. We see differences in gray matter as well as white matter of the brain, and those changes persist throughout the lifespan.
Lead inhibits people's ability to control their emotions. It's a neurotoxin. It interferes and diminishes cognitive capacity. It basically leads to higher rates of mental illnesses, particularly around panic disorder or panic attacks and depression, major depressive symptoms. So this lead poisoning then is like this major toxin running through the blood of black children, causing and elevating all kinds of behavioral issues, violent behavior, and this becomes more prominent.
Lead poisoning is deliberate. It's not an accident, and it's the effects of it. You have, I bet if you were to go down to central booking right now and test every single inmate, the overwhelming majority of them would have high lead levels in their blood.
Well, I think it's necessary with the people who occupy institutions like Morgan that have the kind of histories that we have, where we live in a society that maybe is not as invested in communities of the ethnic composition of people that go to Morgan. And to be quite honest, we know that the political structure in the United States is not the most responsive in a positive way toward the problems and the needs of the African community in this country. But we know we have engaged in these studies. We have a particular type of understanding. And so, as such, as a member of the African community in Baltimore, I don't need to seek out a conduit toward my community. I have a certain understanding of these issues, and I think that it's my responsibility, as long with my colleagues here at Morgan State, to take what we understand, to take what we know, to the communities of people that we care for. And not so much to be consumed with the motivations of those that hold the powers of this political office or that political office and so forth. We want to do what we can do and go directly to those communities of people who deserve whatever information, whatever understanding that we have accumulated.
I'm looking at this. I've created something called a racial equity social impact bond. $3 billion that we need to spend as a city, and half of that is getting rid of lead poison. I think that's where we have to start. We have to get rid of lead in the homes, in the soil, in the air, in the water. Like Baltimore can't thrive with lead poisoned children, with black babies being poisoned left and right. Can't thrive that way. So half of the racial equity social impact bond is focused on that. Let's get rid of lead by like 2022 or as fast as we can. Not allow lead to poison any more babies. Let's get lead out of the environment. And the other half of that is really looking at $500 million to invest in black neighborhoods, get them started in terms of kicking off development in their neighborhood, hopefully without displacement. And then the other billion or so is really centered on violence, anti-violence initiatives, anti-substance abuse initiatives, making sure we spend another $500,000 or $500 million on providing permanent housing for people who are homeless. I think that's a crisis. Baltimore is number one in rental evictions per capita. We are pros in Baltimore at kicking people out of their home and putting people on the street. And that's leading to the problem of homelessness in the first place. So we got to tackle these things head on. Stop mass evictions, stop mass foreclosures. Let's find a way to turn housing into a human right and not just have housing as a private marketable commodity that people can use to make money on when we're putting people on the street left and right. So I think the racial equity social impact bond is really my sort of conception in terms of how we can begin to attack many of these problems. Also think about the notion of creating Baltimore neighborhood reparations. When you look at black neighborhoods being so thoroughly redlined for so long by its own government, we need a mechanism to help repair the damage that was done. And so I advocate for taking 10% of our city budget and taking the top 15 or so redline black communities. And for the next 50 years, let's invest in those neighborhoods and let those residents decide how to build up those communities.
If white children were poisoned with lead, this wouldn't even be a problem, period. Oh, it would have never gotten this far. Because when I was a kid, lead was still in gas. It was still in paint to a certain extent. And I think lead wasn't banned fully until the late 1970s. So lead was still around. But my parents knew that lead was problematic, particularly, in the home with children. And so, yeah, if affluent white children were being poisoned in large numbers with lead, the problem would have gone away decades ago. But there's this fundamental lack of And I used to think that it was a lack of caring, you know, and I'm honestly not sure, but there's this disconnect that many white people have when it comes to these problems. It's almost like, oh, well, it's not happening to us, so who cares? Well, you should care because it's happening to other families and it's happening in our city. We live here. We see the effects of it. We feel the effects of it every single day, whether you know it or not. You feel them, you see them, you deal with it too. Your tax money is paying for it too. So at the very least, tap into that inner white greed and say, hey, I don't want my tax money going to clean up these messes anymore.